Evening and welcome to the Eye Health live stream hosted by Bruno MD and Blue Rex Vision. Tonight, we're going to be looking at managing eye care during COVID-19 and beyond. It's the new normal of overexposure that we're all doing, especially we're actually doing it right now, aren't we? We're all looking at our screens. So I'd like to welcome our experts for tonight, Dr. Paul Karpecki and Dr. Jeffry Gerson. Together, they're nationally and internationally recognized experts in eye care, ocular nutrition, and overexposure to digital devices. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Thank you, Rock.
So, Dr. Karpecki, we'll start with you. Just specifically, what's your area of research and focus?
So my area is kind of a unique one. Obviously, one area is not unique, the area of dry eye disease. I've been doing that for almost 24 years, which is a key focus of mine. But with that, a lot of sub-areas have become quite critical, including understanding the role of trigeminal dysphoria, which is where our nerves get affected by digital devices, digital vision syndrome, which we'll get into a little bit today. It also applies a little bit into even the area of high visible energy understanding. And then nutrition as it relates to those components of more the anterior portion of the eye.
That's interesting. Dr. Gerson, what is your area of focus?
Yeah, so what makes Paul and I such a good pair is his primary focus is the front of the eye. And I would say that mine historically has been primarily the inside or back of the eye, and how different things, exposure to digital devices affect the retina, the inside of the eye. So I think we make a nice pair.
I agree with that. So let's talk a little bit about exposure because, even prior to COVID, we were probably on our devices too much. And now we're spending, I have no idea how many hours a day looking at our devices, from work to play to just trying to relax. Tell us a little bit about recent statistics that you guys have seen about device use in the U.S.
Yeah,
so I'll jump in. Go ahead, Jeff. I'll have you lead this one, and then I'll jump in after you.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just going to say a couple of statistics, and this is all pre-COVID. So, everything now is a little bit of a different normal. So I would imagine these numbers are up, but depending on the study, is anywhere from 65 to 90% of Americans report eye strain from being on digital devices. So regardless of how much they're using them, most people are having some sort of eye strain from devices. And I think we have a graphic that we can pull up here, but that the average person spends around 11 hours on a screen every day, or up to 11 hours on a screen every day, which is quite a bit more than half Americans are using at least 2 devices at a time. And what's really interesting is this is not just in any one age group, and that it's over 70% in the 0 to 18, and it's about 75% that are on screens at least 2 hours a day, 75% of people 60 and up. So it's really across all age groups. This is not just any one demographic that's being overexposed. And again, this is all pre-COVID. So, I would imagine that we can all attest that these numbers are quite a bit more now than what they were even just 3 long months ago.
And I'll actually, you're right on, Jeff, because the only thing I could find post-COVID was actually a Nielsen report. I guess they do these fairly regularly, and they did a during COVID report, and it found that the number was 13.4 hours per day. So that statistic, pre-COVID at 11, jumped to over 13 during this COVID experience or pandemic that we are now part of. So that's a significant increase. I thought 11 was a lot. Nielsen and another study by iSafe showed a little over 13 hours. So you're right. There's a lot of, I don't think our systems were meant to stare at digital devices for 13 hours a day or even 11 hours a day. And so we create a lot of stress on the system, ranging from anterior segment issues, which is the front of the eye that we talked about, to back of the eye stuff with Jeff, where Jeff's expertise resides.
So it's interesting too.
I was going to say, one other thing I wanted to just throw in there is, when we talk about digital device use, I think in general, we think of traditional use, right? When we're at work or kids that are doing their schoolwork on a digital device. But I think something that oftentimes we lose track of is gaming and esports, and that there are around 150 million Americans that play video games. And so that's even a whole other subset of people that are just spending a tremendous amount of time on screens. And again, it's across all age groups, and sometimes they could be some people game for up to 10 hours a day. So that's another area that I want to make sure that we don't completely ignore, that's a pretty significant part of the population.
So when we're talking about these age groups and the segmentation, a lot of times I don't think that people think about people who are not in school, like the younger kids. What sort of exposure do you think kids are having now compared to prior to COVID, who are just being babysitted by devices, for example, or are in maybe a pre-K program where they can't actually go to class? Is that increasing as well?
It really is, and you've summed it up perfectly. And I have three children, twins that are 8.5, and a little guy. Those are the girls, and a little guy that's 6.5. And yeah, for the last 2 months, they just finished school last week. But prior to that, everything was done digitally. There was Zoom conference calls with their teachers. It was homework that was provided. It was a lot of stuff all digital. And to be fair, if I leave them for a few minutes, the first thing they want to pick up is their iPad and start playing little video games, as Jeff was kind of talking about, automatically. And you're right. It gets, when you're not signed up for this, and my wife actually probably did by far the brunt of educating and teaching, and she's an RN. That's not, really her world, is teaching young children. And children tend to be probably a little better for their teacher than for their parents when you're instructing. At least that's been my experience. And so I can understand parents saying, here's something you can go and do. Please give me my time, even if it's just an hour. And I can't fault them for that. But all of these things, whether it's school, whether it's the babysitting with the iPad, whether it's the just needing a break from all this, all lead to increased digital device time that our children have never been exposed to in the past. And, it brings up areas that we understand around the world are major. There's I hate to use the word pandemic as we're going through COVID, but we do have an epidemic of myopia. Over 1 billion children have high nearsighted levels, and they believe one of the biggest reasons for that is using digital devices at a very young age and not having a lot of outdoor exposure. And that's kind of what COVID has essentially created in the United States and North America.
Yeah, Paul, to add on to that, you mentioned outdoor exposure and kids. I have kids just like you. And, so my kids were signed up for different summer camp activities. And now those have all turned into digital, that it's online now. Instead of physically going to the different types of summer camps, it's digital. So, historically, we think of summer as a time to get outside and run around and do things and go places. And so much of that is being transitioned to being online. And so it's a tremendous change from what we're used to.
I think that we're all going to make it through this, but I do think that in a way this is the new normal. And I know that you both have studied viewing habits in other countries and seen what the ramifications are of those habits. What are you guys seeing in your patients now, or expect to see, based on the habits that are maybe viewing habits that might be more prevalent in, let's say, Asia, where the viewing habits were already high?
Well, that's one area where you're spot on with that question, Rock, is the big worldwide area where we're seeing this epidemic of myopia, this high nearsighted. And we don't want to just think of the fact that, those poor children will be in really thick glasses. It's not that. As the eye gets extremely long, it actually leads to other pathologies or diseases, such as glaucoma, where you can lose vision, or myopic degeneration, where the stretching of the back of the eye, because the eye has elongated because of all this near work. It's a natural stimuli because of defocus in the periphery of the back of the eye, causes the eye to get longer, and it leads to these damaging, blinding conditions. And that's why it really is a worrisome component. And the studies show that in parts of Asia, 80 to 90% of children have this myopia or nearsightedness, and 50% of them are considered high myopia, according to the World Health Organization. That means more than 5 diopters, which is a fairly significant amount of nearsighted and beyond. And that's when the risks start to go up, and the numbers are as high as 50%. And they expect that in the US, we'll hit the same 50% number somewhere around 2050. But this was before COVID came along. And we'd have to think now with digital device use going from 11 hours to 13 hours and children doing so much more, that 2050 might be a long ways, maybe a lot sooner than that now.
Yeah, I would agree.
So let's talk a little bit. I'm sure people that are watching want to know what the symptoms are, because we're all staring at screens, and we all have days where, our eyes hurt a little, but we might have a headache, but we don't necessarily attribute that to a device. And so I'd like to maybe have you guys outline what typical issues people are seeing that spend a lot of time in digital devices, and then tell us a little bit about what digital eye strain is.
Yeah, so as far as the devices, Rock, it's a great question, and it's kind of a hard one to answer because the symptoms are so wide ranging. And it's interesting, just over the last couple of weeks, getting back into clinic and talking to people, the range of symptoms is really quite vast. It's anything from headaches from, after sitting on the computer, to blurry vision, to my eyes feel dry and irritated, to just a general sense of being tired and fatigue at the end of the day. So sometimes it's not even an eye specific symptom. It could just be I'm just getting really tired because of the strain during the day. So it's a pretty wide range of what people notice when they're just stuck on a computer for hours and hours on end.
Jeff's completely right. We think of ocular symptoms or eye symptoms as being the main thing, like your eyes get dry because you don't blink as much. And that is one of the factors. You get gritty, dry, burning eyes, maybe you tear more. But there's this whole host of other symptoms like neck stiffness, like headaches, just overall, even personality changes to an extent. It affects your sleeping patterns, your circadian rhythms, which could then lead to more personality issues or even more, just moodiness or changes or even more headaches just from that. And so Jeff's correct. We often used to think of the eye as being what gets affected. And yes, we get dryness and gritty and burning eyes and they tear, but it's much broader than that. And when we start getting in the numbers we're seeing today of digital device use, a lot of those other we call systemic or whole body effects are what we're hearing more of now.
That's fascinating. So really what we're saying is that the overexposure causes systemic issues.
Oh yeah,
it does.
Absolutely.
And it depends too on... Go ahead, Jeff. I'll take it after you.
Okay. So I was going to say, there's been numerous studies that really show that digital device use, especially around bedtime, really, really disrupts sleep patterns. And so this is becoming an even bigger and bigger an issue because when people don't sleep well, then they wake up, they're tired already before they even start, and then they're going to overtax their system with all the digital device use. So, historically we thought of it as, we don't want kids or really anybody reading on a digital device right before you go to bed. But now it's just all day long we're on these devices and it ends up messing with our sleep pattern. And so not only does that change the way we sleep, but it actually puts us at greater risk for all sorts of different systemic diseases, even like high blood pressure or with the eye, glaucoma or diabetes and all these other things like Paul mentioned. We used to think of just what happens to our eyes, but the big picture is it's not just what's happening to our eyes, it's what's happening to us all around because of all this overexposure.
And Jeff's right. If you think about how we evolved over the years, we certainly were used to this high visible energy or this blue light coming in the mornings. That's kind of the first light you'll see as the day breaks, and our bodies learn to use that as a signal for time to get up and wake up, and it still does to this day to an extent. And it's time to get on and being active. And I hear of a lot of people during this COVID time who are saying, I don't even know what time it is anymore. And I think a lot of that is because of the digital device use. If you're getting exposed to that same high visible energy that's coming off a digital device and that high blue light type, high violet light category, which can show some damaging effects, the thing that we truly know it affects more than anything is what Jeff said, the circadian rhythms. Dr. Gerson's completely right. That effect then causes the body to think that it's morning time. You get essentially a jet lag effect. And the more of that you have, the more we see, if you look at people who have sleep apnea issues where they don't breathe well at night and they wake up throughout the night, the incidence of diabetes, of glaucoma, of hypertension is multiple times greater than everybody else. Well, by looking at digital devices for extended periods of time, especially late in the day, And in the evening, you're essentially creating that same environment, and you're going to get the same risk factors for those type of diseases.
So we're going to get into blue light here in a minute. And I think that's fascinating. And I don't think most people understand the implications of that exposure of blue light showering their eye. And I want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of eye strain, if you guys would. I think we all have these symptoms, but I'm curious to know, the eye is something that actually morphs, and there's muscles in there that actually cause you to focus. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in there that causes eye strain, if you could.
I'll take that one because there's a couple levels, and everybody can be variable in this. Meaning, if you have eyes that are relatively well aligned, you're still going to develop some eye strain simply because of the fact that when you're looking at a digital device, you don't have the same blink capacity. Studies by Patel and others have shown that an average person blinks about 14 times per minute, or 14,500 times during the course of a day. It's a lot of blinks. When you're on the computer, your blink rate decreases by 75% on average. So you can imagine that if you're blinking that little, and what does the blink do? Well, it does three things. Number one, it pushes on the lower eyelid, and that's where your oil glands are. Your oil glands are responsible for keeping your tears on your eye. So you can imagine if they're not there, you're going to lose your tears, you're going to develop dry eye. The way your eyes blink is actually the lower part of your eye moves nasally. That's a cleaning effect. If you look at people who are on digital devices extensively, like gamers, like Dr. Gerson described, you'll find that they get a lot of what's called blepharitis. They get buildup of bacteria because they're not cleaning it, because they're holding their eyes open as long as they could, concentrating on the digital device. And so you see a significant amount of that. And then the third thing it does is it pulls up the tear film to coat the eye. So you get what's called exposure. Exposure can lead to keratitis, which is inflammation of the front of the eye, or it could just lead to dry eye and irritation. So there's one contributing factor. But ironically, the eye strain is yet another component that you talked about, Rock. That question was really important because although dry eye contributes to eye strain, what's really happening there is with that near focus, your eyes are relaxed when they're looking into the distance. That's their most relaxed phase. It's kind of like if you had weights in your arm, if you're actually flexing to hold them, that's looking up close. And when you move your arm down and let go, that's looking out into the distance. And so the more near you're doing, the more you're working those muscles. And the muscles work by a nerve called the trigeminal nerve. And certainly this nerve has a lot of effects in the face. It actually is tri, meaning three parts. It works on the mandible, so it plays a role in dental and all of that. It works on the facial, so it plays a key role in that. And then there's an ophthalmic branch, which of course goes to the eye. The ophthalmic branch is very interesting because it has both what's called an afferent pathway. It means it goes to the eye and moves the muscles where they're supposed to be. And it also is responsible for the blink, and it's also responsible for tear secretions. Isn't that interesting? This one nerve has that much of an effect. All of those are tied into looking at digital devices. So that's why the dry eye can play a role. Well, this nerve also has a feedback loop. That is, the body always wants to know where it's at. For example, if you close your eyes and you try to move your fingers together, you probably can come pretty close to them. Well, I wasn't too good, but you can get a little closer. That's called proprioception. That is, your brain knows exactly where your body is at any single time. That way you don't fall over all the time. And so we have a pretty good idea. Well, if you have any slight misalignment, and you would not see this by looking at someone's eyes, they look perfectly centered. But if you had a slight bit, the eyes between what's called saccades and pursuits, which are the movements we use to look at the screen, to read, are constantly trying to find that proprioceptive center, trying to figure out where they are. And so they keep moving back and forth, and they overstimulate the trigeminal nerve. Overstimulation of the trigeminal nerve leads to three specific findings or symptoms that you're going to get. One is neck strain. So if you feel like your neck is really stiff and you got to go to the chiropractor, you could have trigeminal dysphoria. You can have that minor eye misalignment that gets exacerbated by looking at near work for excessive periods of time or digital devices. The second, so you got the neck. Second is headaches. Headaches tend to be sometimes frontal, but then move backwards. And of course, the third branch is the ophthalmic, and patients with this will describe having a dryness sensation to their eyes. And they don't even have dry eye. Now, they can also develop that, as we talked about, but they may not. It could just be the nerve firing out of those three patterns that come in there. So we have patients who come in all the time, and they say their eyes are dry, and I do an assessment, and osmolarity, and all these fancy tests say, nope, you don't have dry eye. And I say, how much time do you spend on digital devices? And they say, oh, that's my whole day. That's what I do for a living. And I test their eyes, and sure enough, they have a very specific movement that confirms trigeminal dysphoria. It's called Exophoria with Convergence Insufficiency. Fancy words that basically mean the eyes have a very little misalignment that makes it hard for them to move up close and far, and they overstimulate. And sure enough, they're the ones who get the headaches, the neck stiffness, and the dryness. The good thing is we have some treatments now for them, including neural lenses, is what they're called, where we can actually position the eyes to where they need to be. My mother-in-law is actually one of the people who's had headaches for years and migraines. In fact, she'd have to go into a dark room, turn the lights off in order to recover for 24 hours. You know what you're doing when you go in a dark room and turn the lights off and turn off all the sound? You're reestablishing the trigeminal nerve. There's no stimuli, so it's able to calm down, get back to where it needs to be. Sadly, not a very good son-in-law. It took me 2 years to figure this out. So she'd been having these migraines, and all of a sudden I started talking to her one day, and I said, "You have neck stiffness too, headaches, digital devices," and we put the lenses in. And until about a month ago, she had not had one headache. She did get one migraine just recently, so I can't say without one since that time. But it could be from all this COVID near work that we're doing today.
That's really interesting. So we've really talked about blue light, and which I said we're going to get to, near focus, blinking. What about just the basics of looking at a screen? How does that affect our posture, and how does that affect the symptoms that we might get that we either attribute to eye strain or add on to eye strain?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times when we're on a digital device, our posture is not very good. So we all already know a lot of times at our offices, or especially if we're used to being in an office and now we're at home, we're not really set up the right way. So the way we're holding our neck or our head is really not the way it should be. Although, on the graphic here, we see somebody sitting at a nice little desk, but so much of digital device use is sitting on a couch or laying in bed or other positions that are not what we're accustomed to. And so I think it's really difficult to say that any one posture position, because there's so many different positions that we use that just ergonomically create issue. I just want to go back and say that the thing that, I agree with everything that Dr. Karpecki said. And I think that really the key, or one of the biggest issues and the easiest one to understand, is just lifting the weights. And because that's the analogy I use with patients every day, that when you have so much strain on your eyes, it's like lifting weights all day long. And wouldn't your arms get sore if you're doing that? And people understand that. And that's what really makes sense to them. And say, wouldn't you like if you could just rest your arms and if you felt better that way? Because it's something that becomes a conversation every day with people.
I think what's surprising about that analogy, and learning more about this, is there is a weightlifting analogy to this, isn't there? Because when we talk about the eye, we talk about exposure, light exposure, blue light hitting the back of the eye, but we also talk about, I think, what you call the ciliary muscles in the front of the eye. There are muscles in there, right? So can we talk a little bit about the front and the back of the eye and how this new normal could begin to affect both parts of the eye?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, so one thing that a term that I've been resistant to say new normal. What I've been saying is today's normal, because unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, who knows what the normal will be tomorrow. But with today's normal, I mean, you're right that we're putting strain on both the front of the eye and the back of the eye. And so let me touch on the back of the eye part for a second, then I'll let Paul kind of touch more on the front of the eye. And so Paul's mentioned the high energy visible light, so the blue light that we're exposed to when we stare at virtually any type of digital device. The way that penetrates into our eye and affects the inside or back of our eye is very different than just ambient light or really any other light that we're really exposed to. And especially when we're on a digital device where this light is so close to us. So when it's arm's length away, that's quite a bit different than if if there's a specific type of light that's 100 feet away or 100 yards away. So we're exposed to this high energy visible light that's very, very close to our eyes, that we know from animal studies does create damage. And so the thing that we worry about as far as the damage inside the eye is something called macular degeneration. And that's something that unfortunately most of us have heard of, and many of us know somebody that has suffered with it. So, all this exposure, we don't know yet. We don't know today, but we don't want to wait to find out 10 years or 15 years from now what it did. It's something that we need to start talking about, thinking about, and acting on sooner rather than later. So that's what I would say as far as the blue light problem on the inside of the eye. I'll leave it to Dr. Karpecki to talk a little bit about the front of the eye portion.
And Jeff's right. I tried to do a little research for today's episode because I thought it'd be valuable to have some science behind it. And because a lot of people say, yes, there's tons of science on the circadian rhythms, on our sleep patterns related to high visible energy. But what about what Dr. Gerson just talked about? And here's a study from 2019 in the International Journal of Molecular Sciences, lead author Lin, shows the effects of the emitted light spectrum of liquid crystal displays on light-induced retinal photoreceptor cell damage. What it showed was that our photoreceptors, that is the back of the eye that Dr. Gerson was just describing, when being exposed, which is the ideal line of photoreceptors is what's called a 661W line cell. That's what they isolated and were able to look at. And they exposed they know that LCDs, such as our digital devices, our iPhones, our computers, our iPads, have different luminances from about 100 to 300 nits. And it's the 300, which is the high visible energy that Dr. Gerson was describing. And sure enough, the conclusion was that the chronic cumulative effects of daily blue light exposure may cause more photochemical damage because they found that exposure to an LCD, liquid crystal display, like in your phones and computers and iPads with luminance of 300 nits for 3 days was shown to statistically decrease the viability of 661W photoreceptor cells. So a great study supporting what he's saying. Now, we don't know if that means how long they're going to get before they have damage. We don't know if it's years, it's months, if there's things we recover, but anything that causes that damage that's noticeable in 3 days has to have some effect long term. And then there's also one for the anterior segment. Fortunately, I found one that's in my area too. And this is a study by Merrick, and it was published also very recently, 2019. I didn't want to pull out, studies from way back when. This is the Journal of Free Radical Biology and Medicine. And it found that blue light exposure in vitro, that means that, right, as you're looking as far as comparing in a lab, so to speak, of the cells themselves or the neurons. So in vivo means in real life, like you would test a person. In vitro means in a lab. Causes toxicity to the trigeminal neurons. Those are the nerves that are responsible for all the movements we talked about. And the glia through increased superoxide and hydrogen peroxide generation. So what they were able to show is that the cytotoxic impact of various wavelengths of visible light, 410 to 630, on primary cell cultures of mice glial cells and trigeminal neurons found exactly that, phototoxicity causing oxidative stress and inflammation. Intraretinal melanopsin is the main mediator of blue light photophobia. So it showed not only was there going to be an effect in vitro in these animal lab studies on light sensitivity and ability to absorb that, but then also on the trigeminal nerve and its effects. So we know that high energy visible light affects the anterior and posterior. And I think it also plays a role in why we stare and why we don't blink as well. It also affects our circadian rhythms, which we talk about. And I do believe it also plays a role of why we're getting this severe nearsightedness. It's kind of one of those triggers. Although most people say it's just the nearness and the defocus, I think there's enough potential that it could also be related somewhat to the phototoxic effects of that high visible energy. As Dr. Gerson said, if you go into ultraviolet light, which is just a slightly smaller wavelength, we know that damages photoreceptors pretty significantly. We're talking about a very slight difference to the high visible energy. It seems unconscionable to me that you can go from here to here and have no effect difference. I got to think you're getting some phototoxicity in those high visible spectrums, and that's what this is showing in this research as well. So it supports that. And then certainly, you got a good image here with dry eye. There's no question dry eye is a disease that is chronic and progressive. You have a long time before it hits that. You got to get it controlled before it becomes that stage. It's kind of like, if you say you had, it's got something called anaphylaxis. It's an extreme example of immunology, but say you ate shrimp every single day your whole life. And then on your 50th birthday, you ate a shrimp and you developed hives all over your body. That's an anaphylactic reaction. If you decided to eat shrimp the next day, what would happen, Dr. Gerson? Would you have 50 more years to develop immunology to this?
That would be bad news.
You'd be in the hospital the next day because your body is already primed. And so what happens even in any of these diseases like dry eye, once the T cells, which are immune cells, become primed, become set at this high level, it doesn't take another 20 years to develop. The very next time you get insult, you go right into that same chronic response. So it's real important to prevent these things as opposed to letting it develop and then have to treat it for the rest of your life. And so I think you're seeing interior effects, which is what Dr. Gerson described it so well with the retina. And also exterior, which, yes, you can control some of that with warm compresses like a Bruder mask. You can lubricate. You can put ZAG or eye-safe controls on your computers. All of those help. But you also have to have the internal ability to control the causes and the body's ability to withstand it in addition to that. So I'm not saying you have to have one or the other. I think they're compatible. I think you want to do both. But don't forget about the importance of the nutrition or the 360 support that comes in for dry eye and retinal disease.
Yeah, the one thing that I just want to real quickly kind of reiterate, because again, it's something that I use in clinic all the time, is your analogy of, when you finally hit the point of having a problem, just picture a cliff, and you want to catch yourself before you fall off that cliff. Because once you fall, maybe you can kind of get put back together, but you're never quite the same. And so we don't want to wait until we say, okay, now I'm having terrible problems when I'm on a computer, what do I do? Or now I've developed damage to the inside of my eye, what do I want to do? I think that really the focus needs to be, what can I be doing now to prevent these problems? Why, I think that what Dr. Karpecki and I would both advocate for is trying to be preventative and not wait until there's an issue with all these things, and just never let yourself fall off that cliff, and really kind of catch it in time before you let the more severe symptoms or any of the real problems really begin.
Sure.
That's true.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that, some of the questions we have coming in on Facebook, are really just about, the normal things that people want to know. Like, what about watching TV? How do I escape blue light if, sunlight is blue? What can we really escape blue light, or the damages of blue light potentially? And if that's not the case, what can we do to help mitigate it?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, because historically the biggest source, and really still today, the biggest source of blue light is just the sun. But part of the difference is the sun is not 16 inches from your face. And so the degree that you're getting effect from sunlight is going to be different, and not as much as a screen that's sitting right in front of you. So, it's a very perceptive question, because no, we cannot completely escape blue light, but we're being exposed to much more of it now than what we have been historically. But what we also now know is there's ways to protect our eyes from that blue light, whether it be through glasses, lenses that help filter it, or different supplements that help protect the inside of our eye, or that help with the muscles, as you mentioned, Rock, the ciliary muscles, that there are supplements we can take that really help the recovery there. And so we can't completely escape it, but we can, one, try to mitigate how much we're exposed to, and number two, to do things proactively to prevent or reduce the effect that the blue light will have.
Yeah, Jeff said it really well. If you think of TVs and the sun, you got a little bit of safety there because of the distance. He said it perfectly. You're not, that the sun is billions of miles away, even though it is an incredible source of blue light, but it's also during the daytime when it's supposed to be around, not at night or in the evenings, and then as you're getting ready to go to bed. Second thing, TVs, because of their distance, do kind of help. In fact, here's a study by Proprioception. Proprioception's one of an author that writes an awful lot of very good scientific papers in my world of dry eye. And he looked at a study that just again published in 2019, one of these real pertinent studies, and it takes a while to get studies published. So 2019 is considered extremely relevant. And in this study, looking at ebooks, he affected the tear film instability, meaning it causes dry eye, and significantly increased burning sensations and tearing to a larger extent than reading a printed book. So what that tells me is that you're going to get a lot of these problems just from looking up close to a degree, because you don't blink as often when you read. But there's another level higher when that visible light, as Dr. Gerson said, is right in front of you. And that's what his study showed. His current study supports the assertion that both and printed books affect tear instability and ocular visual disturbances, but compared to a printed book, reading an ebook or electronic device or anything with high visible energy for 20 minutes significantly increased the symptoms and the severity of what was being found, especially burning sensation and tearing. So that helps us realize that there's an added level that plays a role with the light. And here's another one that was by Rossi, an International Ophthalmology Journal in 2019 also, showed the prevalence of dry eye in video display terminal users. This is a lot of gamers, as Dr. Gerson talked about, but even people today, because of this COVID era, are watching just as much digital device use as gamers. found a cross-sectional Caucasian study in Italy, meaning I like these studies where they look at entire groups of populations, are able to follow this. 194 VDT or video terminal display users, and they assessed the risk factors for dry eye. And they found increased age and the number of hours spent on digital devices are the main risk factors for developing dry eye. So yes, you have an increased risk as you age, but then you have an increased risk just from the amount of time we're spending on these. And it markedly increased due to expansion in the global internet network. We're finding that it's accelerating because of the use of devices. This includes desktops, laptops, tablets, and smartphones, which are now part of worldwide natural living. So, that's research that really kind of is a testament to what we're saying. And I think we have to have that as well. We can't just get up here and tell you we've seen this clinically, although that is important. I think having that backing helps really distinguish the difference in how much more of an impact high visible energy light is when it's up close, even though we're exposed to it fairly regularly. But we've never were meant to be exposed to it 13 hours a day or even 11 hours a day.
So I want to get into some of the solutions that you two can offer for some of these issues, but I just want to touch on AMD or macular degeneration a little bit and talk about what that is. I always understood that to be an issue that increased with age, and it sounds like if we wear sunglasses, even if we're managing our time well with devices, there is an issue with possibly developing this, and I don't think it's necessarily an old person's issue anymore. Can you talk a little bit about what it is, and then we'll talk a little bit about ways to improve our outcomes?
Sure. So, when you say an old person's issue, that's really relative, right? Depending on what our ages are, what old is kind of a moving target. And so I think that's kind of interesting, but that we need to start thinking of age-related issues even earlier than what we would have historically. So, but just I guess a few general comments on what age-related macular degeneration is. So the macula is the very central part of the inside of the back of our eye. And when you look right at something like you see here in the graphic, people that have vision problems from macular degeneration, it affects their very central detailed vision. And that's really what allows us to read, to drive, to be able to clearly see pictures of our kids or grandkids. And so that's why it's something that's such a worrisome disease. It's actually the leading cause of vision loss in people over the age of 60 and 65 in the United States. So it is something that's fairly common. About 70% of who gets macular degeneration is driven by genetics. And so family history is really important. But Brock, you bring up, the idea of controllable or modifiable risk factors. We can't control our family history. We can't control that we get older. And those are two things that increase our risk. But if you think of genetics as being 70% of it, that means that the way I try to describe this is you think of a light switch. And if you have a light switch, and for the light to be on, it has to go up all the way. What genetics does is it pushes it about 3/4 of the way. And so we need to do everything we can to prevent the other 30% to push that light switch up and turn the light on, or turn on macular degeneration. And so I think we'll get into it a little bit, but things like diet and exercise and taking the right supplements can really help onset, or if you even have early, to prevent the progression of macular degeneration.
So let's talk about some of our solutions. We talked about diet as a solution. We'll get into that in a second. But what are some simple behavioral changes we can make to alleviate some of these symptoms of overexposure?
Well, one you've alluded to here is the 20-20-20 rule. And, there's value to that. Dr. Gerson described really well that, if we're lifting weights and we had our arms in kind of a fixed position, after a while that muscle would get really sore. Yet that's what we're doing when we're looking at digital devices. Our intraocular muscles only relax when we look into the distance. That would be like letting the weights down. So we have to, allow them to have that ability to relax during the day. So about every 20 minutes, it makes some sense to look into the distance, about at least 20 feet away, because that's when your muscles relax. and for at least 20 seconds to do that. I'll take it a couple steps further, though. I think you also need to ensure that you take some time to blink during that fact. Remember, the blink rate goes down 75% when we're on digital devices. Your oil glands are getting congested. Without oils, you have no way to keep your tear film on. Your oil layer is on the very front of your tears, and it's only 0.02 microns. That's an incredibly thin amount. It'd be the equivalent of, if you imagine your tears as a football field, the oil layer would be the same as taking dental floss at one end. That'd be about the scale. So it's that small of a layer. So it doesn't take a lot for it to be affected. And then if it's affected, the rest of the tears evaporate. So the way that they come out is with your blink. Your blink forces the oils to come out of your lower eyelid and even from your upper eyelid to pull them. So good blinks during that 20-second time to kind of force the oils to move will really help you out. And then the other thing you got to keep in mind that if you do have trigeminal dysphoria, a condition where your eyes have that slight misalignment, a very, very specific movement that causes overstimulation, resulting in headaches and neck stiffness and dryness of the eyes, 20 minutes of taking a break is not going to do it. You're going to need to see an eye doctor, an optometrist who knows what they're doing in that eye alignment measurement, who has something like a neural lens technology, who can prescribe the correct neural lens to correct for the alignment. And then you can go back to this 20/20 to alleviate some of the strain, and you can use it to do the blink because you'll still get dry eye. But I've had patients come in and say, doc, I did the 20/20 and my headaches are still here and my neck's stiff. Well, that's because they had trigeminal dysphoria. That's a whole other level. But digital devices really pull that out. So if you don't have that condition, this will work. If you have that condition, you need to see an eye doctor, and then this will work after that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that the 20/20/20 rule works great if there's, or maybe not great, but works relatively well if there's no other underlying condition. If your eyes are already dry, if they're already misaligned, if you already have any type of focusing issue, then trying to do this isn't going to fix the problem that's only exacerbated by all the digital device use. So I think the recommendation to make sure that you do see an eye care professional is a really important one, especially if you try something like this and you're still having issues.
Well said.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about other changes we can make to our eye health. And this is a term some may not have heard before, and I certainly hadn't before I started working with you gentlemen. It's called ocular nutrition. The only ocular nutrition I was familiar with was carrots that my mom made me eat, and I hate carrots. Can we talk a little bit about what ocular nutrition is, and is it a viable way to help improve eye health in some of our outcomes?
Yeah, so Rock, it's funny that you bring up the idea of carrots. So it's over 50% of Americans, if asked what's the most important food for your eyes, will say carrots. And I hear that from patients all the time. They bring it up. And carrots may not be bad, but they're probably not the ideal food to eat to really, really help your eye. But what ocular nutrition means is really kind of just what it says. It's trying to use nutrition to help your ocular or eye health. Just like you think of eating healthy for your body, there's things we can do to eat healthy, or probably more importantly, take the right supplements to be healthy for our eyes. And, I really do believe, and there's plenty of studies that show, and I think we'll get into some of those, that really show that through proper nutrition, we can really decrease or alleviate a lot of the problems that we have, in particular with eye strain in our eyes. So it is a really important concept that not enough of us, I think, really pay attention to. About 50%, actually over 50% of Americans take a multivitamin. But if you ask the same question, how many people take a vitamin specific to their eyes, it's a pretty small number. And it's a number that hopefully we can help raise the awareness so that people understand that there are things I can do to help my eyes through nutrition. The other thing that I'll point out real quickly is that when we say nutrition, and I think Dr. Karpecki would probably agree, the best way to get nutrition is through eating the right foods. The reality, however, is that very few of us get really the nutrition we need just in general, and specifically for our eyes, just through foods. And that's why it's so important to talk about specific supplements, because if you don't get enough through your diet, we need to add into it.
That's really well said. And a lot of people ask the question, if I'm already taking a supplement like a general multivitamin, so many of those have been used, why would I need something more specific for my eye? Well, the eye has very unique pigments. In fact, that's what's responsible for all those photoreceptors in the back of the eye. And when we start to look at the macula in particular, your central focusing area, there are significantly higher levels of pigment that come from carotenoids. Carotenoids can only be provided by certain elements of food or by certain supplementation. We can't make a lot of those ourselves. And so it is a very unique organ in that sense. And so you truly, it's important to have whole body nutrition. That's become extremely evident here as we've gone through COVID-19, where unfortunately patients who had comorbidities, meaning other diseases like diabetes and hypertension and cancers and other key systemic diseases were more vulnerable. And we know that. So it is important that we do that, but it's also equally important that we focus on the eye and its specific carotenoids and its pigment and the nutrients that can help it. Now, sometimes there's overlap. It will get into the system and help a little bit too. I know in dry eye, I can put someone on omega fatty acids and it'll help. Those omega fatty acid supplements, omega-3s, GLAs with 3s, those sort of things are all very, very effective, but they also help the heart a little bit, the skin and the hair, so you get this residual. When it comes to the whole body, you get a little bit in the macula and the retina too, but you often need more. But Jeff's right, if you could get it from food, you have the ultimate source. It's just that's not reasonable the way we live in our lives and what's available, that for almost all of us, we're going to have some level of supplementation for the eye.
Okay. So let's talk about these specific carotenoids. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, that work on the front and the back of the eye. And how do we get them?
Yeah, so I can go over a couple of them. So one that's kind of an emerging ingredient is something called astaxanthin. And what's amazing about astaxanthin is it has about 6,000 times the antioxidant power of vitamin C. And so we all think of vitamin C as being a pretty common, and we think of it as being a really good thing, but astaxanthin is something that's 6,000 times more potent as antioxidant. And there's been numerous studies that show that when we have enough astaxanthin, and generally through supplementation, not through diet, because we don't get enough in our diet, that we can really help the focusing mechanism that Dr. Karpecki was talking about, and help our eyes focus in and out much better when we're on a computer, help our eyes to focus to a greater degree more quickly, and reduce our eye fatigue and strain. And astaxanthin is, as you mentioned, Rock, it's a carotenoid. Two really important carotenoids for the inside of our eyes we see in the graphic here are lutein and zeaxanthin. And they're particularly helpful in trying to prevent macular degeneration. So between these three carotenoids, we really have the idea of protecting the eye both from front, astaxanthin, to back, lutein and zeaxanthin. Now, when we talk about food sources of these, astaxanthin can be found in orange pigmented, generally seafood. And the average American gets somewhere around or less than 20 milligrams per year. And studies show that the way to really reduce this eye strain and fatigue is to get somewhere between 4 and 6 milligrams per day. And so the only way to do that is through supplementation. And with the lutein and zeaxanthin, we know the average American gets between 0.5 and 2 milligrams per day, even if you're taking a multivitamin. And to really be beneficial when it comes to macular degeneration, you probably need 6 to 10 milligrams per day. So again, a reason why it's really important to consider supplementation with these really, really important carotenoids. The way we can get the lutein and zeaxanthin through diet are green leafy vegetables like spinach and kale and broccoli, or even romaine lettuce. But as Dr. Karpecki pointed out, it's really just not really realistic in today's society to think we're going to get enough of these to really derive the benefit that we really need. So we can see here the recommendations of intake versus what's really recommended, how much we really need. There's a huge gap. And so, I think instead of saying, well, there's a huge gap, to really realize we have an opportunity. And that's why we have supplements to really supplement or add in to what we're currently eating to get the desired effects.
On the anterior, just real quickly, sorry, Rock, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but just kind of ties into what Jeff had said on, astaxanthin. The anterior is also affected. I know you're on the retina, but, if you look at some of the research, they've and again, as mentioned, you'd have to eat quite a bit of coho salmon in order to get to that level, at least 3 servings, as most of us wouldn't eat during the day. Or you'd have to have 1.5 servings of sockeye salmon, which has even more of that pink pigment, red pigment you're used to seeing. But there are studies to show that you can see closer, a 21.7% increase in your ability to accommodate, which means in seeing up close, after only 4 weeks of using astaxanthin. That was 5 milligrams per day. You can improve your accommodative speed and how quickly you see near and far, which play a key role, as we lose that a lot when we're on digital devices. It also has been shown to work in something called uveitis, which is one of my specialty areas, or iritis, where you get inflammation inside the eye. And these patients can sometimes have it multiple times, and never thought of adding this in, and yet that's become one of the things that plays a role. And it even has been shown to help with your mitochondrial sources, which is like your battery cells that keep things from an energy standpoint working. Perhaps even in glaucoma because of its benefits to ocular blood flow. So there's quite a bit of opportunities here with a carotenoid such as that, both on the posterior segment or back of the eye, as Dr. Gerson described, but even just adding that in for the anterior portion or front of the eye as well.
Paul, just real quickly, you mentioned the mitochondria, which is a part of the cells. It's really kind of the powerhouse and what really really drives things and gets things going. And interestingly, with astaxanthin, there's even studies that show improved performance and recovery, even in athletics. And so, and the only reason I point that out is because earlier we talked about, thinking of things holistically and systemically. And so these things that are good for our eyes are not just good for our eyes. That, if someone's an athlete and they're stuck on a computer all day and then they go for a bike ride when they're done with work, that by taking the right supplement, they could potentially be helping relieve some of the strain on the computer and potentially help their muscle recovery when they're done with their bike ride. So the things we're talking about they don't live in a vacuum of just your eyes, that they're good for us in a really big picture way.
So in terms of nutrition, it sounds like getting the amount of lutein, zeaxanthin, astaxanthin from diet is difficult at best. And supplementation is a good way to do it. Again, I don't think there's a lot of awareness out there of supplements made for these issues. Can you talk a little bit about the ARIDS-2 study and what we'd be looking for in a supplement based on your learnings from that massive study a few years ago?
Yeah, so the ARIDS-2 study was a study in people that have macular degeneration that's already kind of advanced. So it's not people with super early disease. These are people that have moderate age-related macular degeneration. And it showed that with a specific supplement or a specific formulation, that you can decrease the risk of it getting worse to where it really causes a significant visual change. I think that's the easiest way to explain it. And it was a massive study. It was over 4,000 people in this study. And so as you can see here, that it's pretty impressive reduction of risk of getting worse and of getting worse the way it looks in the eye, but more importantly, a massive reduction in the risk of losing some vision because of macular degeneration. And again, what's so important about this study is the levels of the ingredients in this study are far beyond the average American or average person, no matter where you live, intake through diet. And that's what makes supplementation so important.
Yeah, Jeff's right. We have to look as doctors at where that study is, and it is the largest body of research that exists. It points to the fact that an ARIDS-2 formulation is the best that we know of for patients who have intermediate stage macular degeneration and beyond, or atrophy in one eye, which is loss of vision in one eye, to maintain the other eye. Those are the patients that were studied, and there's nothing of greater science than that to refute it or to look at other options. But there are a lot of the patients we described today that are earlier in the disease, where they're having only problems with dark adaptation, and there's devices for that, or their carotenoids are extremely low, and you do hand scanning, Pharmanex, things like that give you measurements, then you could choose your nutrients based on what's missing, or the parts of your carotenoid low, which a lot of people are. When you start testing, it's amazing how much issues you see with dark adaptation, meaning someone who already has likely to have macular degeneration or extremely low carotenoid measurements. And those are the patients that are probably better served with a non-AREDS2 formulation. Now, they're still going to have a lot of the carotenoids we described today. You're still going to do kind of different, and even the big companies, that have different versions. They have versions for each, and so you want to be able to, know what you're on the right thing for where you are in your disease state, as Dr. Gerson described. And the only way to do that is to see your eye care practitioner. They can look in there and say, oh yes, this is stage 2, or they can use these more sensitive tests we have today to even isolate and determine if someone has macular degeneration literally years before they develop it.
So it sounds like we're looking at, a whole spectrum of potential issues and biologies that can cause certain outcomes. But do you both recommend supplementation for the kind of ocular nutrition that we feel is lacking or you can't get from diet? And is there a specific brand or product that you've seen that could help?
Yeah, so I would say that it's something that it comes up virtually every day, and it's something that I talk about very frequently with patients. And right now, maybe because people are on computers more and noticing the strain, people are more open to this idea than ever before. But yeah, so I think it's important to talk about this with patients, be proactive, like Dr. Karpecki said, not wait until someone has more advanced disease. Find it really early before you can even see it by using sophisticated testing, and start discussing different formulations. So, on the graphic here, we have BlueRx, which is a combination of, among other things, astaxanthin, lutein, and zeaxanthin. And so the lutein and zeaxanthin are what's so protective for macular degeneration, the inside of the eye, and the astaxanthin for more the front of the eye, for relieving the stress on the muscles that we were talking about, and hopefully relieving some of the dry eye type symptoms. So having, knowing about specific supplements like this is so important. And again, that's part of what's important about going to your eye care provider, is getting a specific recommendation. Because just going to the store and buying something random off the shelf, or going online and trying to figure out for yourself what's best for you, may end up resulting in you getting the right thing, but oftentimes it just ends up with you taking another vitamin that isn't probably the right thing for you. So taking a high quality supplement is really important, because there's so many supplements that are out there, and there's been all sorts of studies and articles written both in scientific literature as well as mainstream press like New York Times, talking about supplements that aren't what they say they are. And so what's so important is making sure that you take something that has the right things in it, that what's in it is what it says is in it, that it's actually true to the label.
Yeah, recently, back last year, end of 2019, there was something like 1,400 brands that the FDA had pulled from the market because it didn't have what, as Dr. Gerson said, what the labeling said was supposed to be in there. So you really, it just shows you just can't trust everyone. Some of these were Costco brands, some were in other areas, and it wasn't Costco, it was just the brands that they thought had what was on the label. So I think you really do. And even in my clinic, just to Dr. Gerson's point, if I determine that dry eye is the bigger factor, I'm going to be focusing more on omega fatty acid type supplement than ones that I prefer, that have done well. If I have a person who spends a significant amount on digital devices, as so many people are doing right now, I love that there's a product like BlueRx that can kind of focus on that high visible energy absorption and has the astaxanthin and the other components. And if I determine it's intermediate AMD, I'm going to be talking about an AREDS2 formulation. And prior to that, I'd be looking at something as we described here with carotenoids, and that would be more of a pure carotenoid type supplement. And so it'd be hard to guess where you are without an exam to know which component is the bigger factor. And that's why it's so important to determine, and then to have the appropriate nutritional supplement, as Dr. Gerson described. And fortunately, we have really good high quality brands such as this that have been really tested that do well. But as we just described, and to your question, Rock, yeah, there is very specific types of recommendations that I have in particular, based on what I think is the major part of the body, or the eye itself, I should say, that is affected. And even whole body, to some extent, becomes important to manage. So if it's anterior or front of the eye, if it's posterior, and the degree of it, such as intermediate stage macular degeneration, all have very specific recommendations. And you just got to hear about some of these phenomenal carotenoids and how important they are in these disease states.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on that real quickly, oftentimes I'll be talking to patients about more than one supplement, and it's not always one size fits all. Because as Dr. Karpecki is pointing out, someone could have a certain stage of macular degeneration that requires one thing, but then they also have dry eye issues that may require something in addition to that. So some people are on more than one supplement. Just like if somebody has, for example, high cholesterol, they may need more than one medication for that. And so it's really important to realize that it's not a one size fits all, that people may need more than one really good quality supplement to really address everything that they need.
Well, doctors, I want to thank you both so much for spending time with us tonight. There's so many other questions I and the audience wants to ask you, and so maybe we'll have to revisit this in the future. I hope we can all get together again at some point.
Sounds good.
When we talk about eye health, we want to make sure, and even though this program is hosted by Bruno MD, that you do touch base with your eye professional before you make any changes to your diet or to supplementation. And I think that's important. And if you are interested in taking a look at BlueRx, we're offering 25% off tonight. We'll leave that code up for you guys. We'll put it up after the show's over. But doctors, once again, thank you for joining us. And if you're looking into Bruno MD, please look us up on our social handles. We're all over the place. And we hope to see you guys again in the future for another Eye Health live stream. Thank you, doctors, and we'll talk to you gentlemen soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.